My name is William Kiker, and this is going to be my extemporaneous, let's get that out of the way. This is going to be my extemporaneous debate masterclass. This was filmed back-to-back with the impromptu masterclass, that's why I'm in the same clothes. But, basically, extemporaneous debate is kind of the debate corollary of impromptu speaking. So impromptu is a very beginner-friendly speech event. It's an event that doesn't require a lot of prep time, that allows for beginners to get directly into it, but also because of the lack of prep time, it's pretty hard to master, it's pretty hard to do well at a high level. Extemporaneous debate is kind of the same way. The amount of prep time is higher, it's 30 minutes, and the amount of speaking time is lower, it's only 2 minutes. But the key difference is that extemporaneous debate, you're not just trying to yap, you're not just trying to give a speech, but you're trying to make a coherent argument in favor or against a resolution in a way that will convince a judge. And that is a lot harder to do than just to give a good speech. So, backing up, what is extemporaneous debate? Extemporaneous debate is a debate format. And the premise of the format is that you get 30 minutes to prepare, and then the debate itself is really quick. It's a 2-minute speech on the affirmative, 2-minute speech on the negative, and then 2-minute rebuttals for each side, 2-minute closing speeches for each side, 1 minute of questioning after the first 2 speeches, 1 minute of prep time before the rebuttals and before the closing speeches. That's the nature of extemporaneous debate. So, what do I mean by affirmative? What do I mean by negative? What are we arguing over? The thing that we're arguing over is called a resolution. The resolution will always start resolved, colon. That's why it's called a resolution, because it starts with resolve. And then it will be some statement of opinion about a way to change the status quo, or some statement of value or principle or something like that. So it could be like resolved. The United States ought to require that all workers receive a living wage. That is an opinion that some people have, some people don't. Like some people believe, yes, all workers ought to receive a living wage. And some people say, no, not all workers ought to receive a living wage, right? Like that's a live debate that exists in society. And so those are the kinds of topics that you're going to be using in debate, like living wage or government surveillance infrastructure on the southern border, that kind of thing. And it's always going to be posed in the form of a statement. So if it's posed in the form of a statement, how do we debate it? Basically, you have 2 sides. One is called the affirmative, which means they affirm the resolution. They say, yes, great resolution, good idea, so smart, very true. All workers ought to receive a living wage. The United States should increase surveillance infrastructure on the southern border. Like that's what the affirmative is saying. They have what's called the burden of proof. What the burden of proof means is that they must prove that the resolution is a true statement. And so they have to prove in some way that the United States ought to require that all workers receive a living wage. The other side is called the negation, or the negative, or the neg. The affirmative is also called the aff. And the neg basically says no. The United States ought not require that all workers receive a living wage. The United States should not expand its surveillance infrastructure on the southern border. They have what's called the burden of rejoinder. And what the burden of rejoinder means is that they do not only have to disagree with the aff, they're not just saying, oh, aff is wrong, but they have to actively prove the inverse of the resolution to be true. So while the affirmative has to prove that all workers ought to receive a living wage, the negative must prove that not all workers ought to receive a living wage. Like, those are, that is the burden of the negative. The negative isn't just saying aff is wrong, the negative is trying to prove a statement of their own, which is why they present a case of their own. But what do I mean by a case? What is a case? A case is just the initial arguments that either side presents in favor or against the resolution. So the affirmative case is just going to be all of the arguments that the affirmative makes in favor of the resolution. It's also called all of their constructive arguments. Constructive because they're constructing their position. And similarly, the negative case is going to be their constructive arguments, where they're constructing their negative position or their position in favor of the rejoinder to the resolution, which is when you insert that word not. So ought not, should not. That's what the negative is defending. That's called the rejoinder. So now when you're in an extemp debate round, you don't get to pick your side. You're basically told 30 minutes before your round starts, this is the this is the topic, this is your side, prep, right? That's all you're given basically. This is your topic, this is your side, this is your opponent, this is your room. Deal with it. You don't get to pick the topic, you don't get to pick the side, none of that. So you need to be prepared to argue for stuff that you don't necessarily believe. Like maybe you are a big fan of increasing surveillance infrastructure on the southern border. You think the southern border is not surveilled enough. We need to surveil it. We need to send people over there and get to looking. And you are then assigned to argue against increasing surveillance infrastructure on the southern border. If that happens, you do not get to complain, you do not get to yell at the tournament organizers, you do not get to beg and plead with your opponent to switch sides. You just deal with it. You argue for the other side. So how do you do that? Well, you have to prepare. You have to prep. In an extemp debate, the amount of prep that you get is a lot less than you get in other events. You get half an hour of prep total. And so there's a few key steps that you need to go through in your prep time. The first is background information and understanding the resolution. Because you might be asked a question, or you might be given a resolution like resolved, federalism is the best system of government to balance the interests of local communities and the federal government. And you might look at that and you say, what on earth is federalism? If that's your reaction, then you need to spend a little bit of time during prep time to understand, what is federalism? What exactly is this resolution saying? What does my side believe? And that question of what does my side believe is also the same as the question of what is your advocacy. And so if I say the affirmative advocacy is, or the negative advocacy is blank, that's basically saying what is the arguments, what are the arguments that you're making in the round getting to? And so let's say that we have a resolution like resolved the United States ought to require that all workers receive a living wage. There's a few different ways to approach that from both sides, right? If you're on the negative, for example, you could say that it's just actively a bad idea, that no, not everyone should receive a living wage. Some people are 17 and working a minimum wage job and they don't need to receive a wage that's enough to support a family. That's an argument that you can make. You can also make the argument that maybe morally it's a good idea to require that everyone receive a living wage, but there are practical reasons why we shouldn't do it. Maybe as a matter of policy it's bad. In both of those cases, you're negating the resolution, you're on the same side, but you have a different advocacy. And so after you have figured out what exactly the resolution means, the second step is to think about your advocacy. What are you actually saying? How are you going to affirm the resolution? How are you going to negate the resolution? Because there's a few different ways to do it. But basically, try to do those two steps really quickly, as fast as you can, basically. Obviously, you want to make sure that you fully understand the resolution, and if that takes a little bit of time for you, that's fine. Ultimately, debate is educational. If you're arguing about something you don't understand, you're gonna lose and you're not gonna get anything from it. And so make sure that you understand it. And if it takes you a little bit to think of a good advocacy, that's also fine as well. But generally try to get through these steps pretty quickly because you haven't done a lot of substantive stuff yet. And so after you're done with your advocacy, at that point, it's argument generation, which is what it sounds like. Literally, think about your advocacy, and then think about arguments that support your advocacy. So let's say I'm on the negative of the living wage topic. I say it's practically a bad idea. Even if morally it's fine, as a matter of policy, blah, 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 it's a practical bad idea. Immediately, I start to think, bad for the economy. How is it bad for the economy? People lose their jobs, prices go up. Boom, immediately I have two arguments. I can just take those two arguments and run. When you're doing argument generation, I would typically recommend having 3 arguments, but only using 2 in your actual speech. Here's why. A lot of the time, when you're initially coming up with arguments, it's kind of hard to know which ones are strong and which ones are weak, because you haven't done research on them yet. You haven't figured out what people are saying about them. What does the evidence say? That kind of thing. And so, in an extemp speech, in an extemporaneous debate, constructive speech, where you're presenting your case, I usually recommend having 2 main arguments, and we'll get into the structure of a speech later. But typically, I recommend having 2 main arguments, but I would try to generate 3 for 2 reasons. One, because it means that you can pick the two strongest, or two, sometimes you actually do want to have 3 arguments. Like, that's up to you. Some people do run 3 arguments in an extemporaneous debate speech. I typically don't, but that's a personal choice. 3 arguments is completely fine. So, now we have gotten our 3, we've figured out what the resolution means, we've figured out our advocacy, we have 3 arguments. Now, we research the arguments. And so, let's say my 3 arguments are like, it's unfair to people on slightly above the minimum wage that they are then like put on the exact same level as someone who was like made a lot less money before. Like, if this is the bar, that happens, and like maybe I'm saying that's unfair. Maybe I say inflation goes up, like prices go up, and maybe I say people lose their jobs. At this point in my prep process, which hopefully is pretty early in the prep process, I am going to just go on the internet and look stuff up and try to find sources that agree with me. And so if I say that increasing the minimum wage to a living wage, which maybe like that's what I'm responding to, it's a complicated topic, but minimum wage, living wage, let's just correlate them for now. If you actually get into this topic, this is the current topic in another form of debate called Lincoln Douglas. If you actually get into that topic, you'll start to know why me doing that isn't always the best idea, but for now, let's just correlate them. So if I start to say, okay, minimum wage increases unemployment, I want to find sources that agree with me. I want to find sources that also believe that the minimum wage causes unemployment. And if I'm on the AF, I'm going to want sources on the other side. In other forms of debate, you're going to be wanting to do research that's more balanced. In extemporaneous debate, you're only arguing for one side. In other forms of debate, you're going to have to one day argue for the AF, the next day argue for the neg. In between rounds, you're going to be switching. Like, you're going to be switching sides all the time, which means that you have to do balanced research. In extemp debate, you don't have to do balanced research. In fact, don't do balanced research. Except if you're finding background information, don't do balanced research. Like, you have arguments, find sources that support the arguments, go, go, go. You don't have time to try to find arguments for the other side. You do in a lot of other scenarios. There are very, 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 very many cases where you absolutely do want to research the other side. This is like the one where you don't. But basically, you're finding arguments, finding sources that support the arguments that you're making. And they need to support them in 2 different ways, which I'm going to tell you why these are the 2 ways once we get to the actual structure. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find sources that tell you that your argument is true. So like, I need a source, like if I'm saying increasing the minimum wage leads to an increase in unemployment, I want a source that tells me, like, yes, that is a true statement about the world. It is a fact that when the minimum wage goes up, unemployment goes up. In reality, that's disputed, but I want a source that says that it's true. But I also want a little bit more than that. I want something, not necessarily a source, but at least a really well thought out piece of my own analysis that tells me that it is bad when unemployment rises. Because like, imagine I'm a judge, and I'm sitting there, and I've got my little judge cap on, and I'm saying, so what I'm supposed to do as a judge is I'm supposed to leave all of my prior knowledge, all of my prior beliefs at the door. And I'm supposed to judge only on what is said in the round. If I'm up there as a debater and I tell you, judge, unemployment goes up, that is a big deal. My next point is about inflation. I'm sitting there as a judge and I'm like, well, he told me that unemployment goes up, but like, why does that matter? Why do I care that unemployment goes up? And so you want to have a source that says that like, when unemployment goes up, people die. When unemployment goes up, like, people have mental health challenges, their health gets worse, like, their quality of life goes down. Like, there's a bunch of reasons why it is bad that unemployment goes up. That can be evidence. That can also be, in this format especially, your own analysis, where, I mean, I think it's kind of intuitive that, like, if people lose their jobs, they'll have less money and can afford less things, and that's bad because people like to have things. Like, that's a pretty intuitive understanding, intuitive argument, but say that. Don't just assume that your judge is along with you. Say that. Make explicit the reason why the stuff that you say matters. And that brings me to the structure of the speech. Because now that we have our arguments on our little Google document, because you probably want to be doing this in Google Docs. Then we're going to actually be creating this speech. How are we going to do that? Well, the typical structure of an extemp debate speech or an extemp debate case is as follows. You start with an intro, and your intro should be like really short, 1-2 sentences, quickly jump into your topic. So like, because I believe that, because I believe that poverty is high enough already and shouldn't go up even further, I am so proud to negate in today's debate. You want to just have a quick hook that kind of brings your judge along with you, and then you want to state your side. Typically people will say, I am so proud to negate resolve. The United States ought to require that all workers receive a living wage. They stay the full topic. I usually don't in extemp debate. It's your choice. I'm usually just so pressed for time that I'm like, I can't add this. But if you want to add the full resolution, a lot of judges appreciate that, and so like, go for it. But after you say your intro, then you have a choice. Your choice is whether you want to have a burden or you don't want to have a burden. But before you make that choice, let's understand what a burden is. And so a burden is basically you telling the judge on what basis they ought to decide who wins the round. What do I mean by that? What I'm saying is that basically a lot of arguments can boil down to this. It can boil down to one side says something like, inflation goes up, and that is bad for the economy. And then the other side says that, like, this is morally the right thing to do. Notice, those arguments can completely be at odds with each other. Like, one argument points towards you affirm, one argument points towards you negate, but they don't clash with each other. When I say clash, I mean they don't contradict each other. It can be simultaneously true that it causes inflation to go up and that it's morally good. And so your burden is basically you telling the judge on what basis they have to evaluate the round. Should they care about things like inflation, or should they care about things like morality? So you would say, judge, vote on the basis of which side is the most moral, or vote on the basis of whether the affirmative can prove that their side is the most moral. Burdens are always framed as either vote on if the affirmative can prove this, always the affirmative, not the negative. Remember, affirmative has the burden of proof. So it will be phrased as either vote X if the affirmative can prove Y, or it will be vote for the side that best does X. So vote for the most moral side, vote for the affirmative if they can prove that they are the most moral side. Those are like two ways to state the same burden, basically. So the reason why you would want to have a burden is that it gives the judge a good lens through which to evaluate the round that is going to be helpful to you. Where, like, if you're the side that argues for morality, you can basically say, only evaluate this through morality. And if your opponent doesn't respond to that, you can try to take out anything they say about, like, inflation by saying, we're not even talking about inflation, we're talking about morality. And it also gives you a good out in your final speech, your closing speech, which basically, I do this like every time, where I say, judge, in my opening speech, I told you that the burden is to vote for whichever side is the most moral. Here are 3 reasons why the affirmative is the most moral, therefore vote affirmative. That's what all of my crystallization speeches look like. So those are some of the reasons why you would want to use a burden. It helps you in your final speech, and it can give judges something to latch on to, basically, when they're making their decision. Why would you not want to use a burden? The reason why you would not want to use a burden is because half of your judges have no idea what it is, and they don't know what you're talking about, and they're not going to listen to you. And that's a lesson I had to learn the hard way, where I used a burden at the Florida State Championships, and the Florida League is really, really parent heavy. The judges don't really have experience, and so they didn't know what I was talking about, and I just lost. Even though I very, very clearly proved the burden, and that should have been enough to win, it wasn't. And so the burden can kind of become extraneous, and it can kind of become like a trap, where you spend all this time arguing, I met the burden, they didn't dispute the burden, I win the round, and the judge goes, I don't care about this burden that you just said, in which case you lose, right? So the burden can be kind of a double-edged sword. It's a matter of both personal preference and also the league that you're debating in. If you're debating in a league that has more experienced judges, they're going to really care about that burden. They're going to really like that burden. If you're debating in a league with parent judges, they're going to ignore you, and you might lose the round because you focus too much on achieving your burden. So up to you whether you want to keep that burden in after your intro. But after the burden or after the intro is going to be the main body of your speech, the main points that you're making. Arguments in debate are called contentions. And so those are going to be the main arguments that you're going to be making. So let's say I'm running a case, but when I say running, like when I say I run an argument, that just means I'm making the argument in a round. And so let's say I'm running a case or making a case in a round that negates the resolution about the living wages on the basis of unemployment and inflation, right? My two contentions are going to be contention 1, unemployment increases, contention 2, inflation increases, right? Those are going to be my contentions. Each of your contentions should be able to, independently of the other contention or however many other contentions you have, prove the resolution to be true or to be false. And so it could be the case that the only thing I said in my round was the first contention. And if the judge believes it, they should vote for me. It could also be the case that the only thing I said in my round is the second contention. And if the judge believes it, they should vote for me. If you're saying a contention, and even if the judge believes every single word of it, they still don't vote for you, then it's not a strong enough contention. You need to rework it or you need to replace it, because at that point it's not very strong. So, let's say that we have our two contentions, right? Our two contentions are going to have what's called a tagline. Our tagline is just a brief summary of what the contention says. The tagline is also called a claim, and that leads us into our claim, warrant, impact structure. Because every argument that you're going to make in a round, in all of debate, is going to follow the exact same structure. It's going to start with a claim. The claim is just going to be like, what are you saying? So like, my claim is that inflation increases if you increase the minimum wage. That's my claim. It's then going to have a warrant. A warrant is just a reason to believe that the claim is true. So my warrant could be that like a study by researchers at Georgia Tech proved that historically when states increased their minimum wage, they saw an increase in local prices compared to states that did not increase their minimum wage. That could be a study that exists, and that study would prove the claim to be true. And then after that, you have your impact. Your impact is just, why do I care? And so it's like, when inflation goes up, consumers find it harder to afford basic necessities, the economy suffers, spending goes down, people lose their jobs, like it's bad. Like, there's just reasons why inflation is bad. And so that would be my claim, my warrant, and my impact. You can also have contentions that are structured with subpoints. So let's say instead of having two contentions, one on inflation, one on unemployment, I wanted to have like a contention on the economy and a contention about health. And then under my contention on the economy, I have two subpoints, two smaller arguments under the contention. Those could be like inflation and unemployment. The thing about subpoints is that they should be specific arguments that prove a contention to be true, and the specific argument that you're making should be in itself enough to prove that the contention is true. So like, if I have a contention that's like, the economy is harmed when the minimum wage is increased, it should be sufficient to prove that to be true if I prove that like unemployment increases, or if I prove that like inflation increases. Both of those individually, both of those subpoints individually, are enough to prove the contention to be true, which is then enough to prove the overall resolution in my advocacy to be true, right? And so if you're running subpoints, again, that don't fully prove the contention, then don't bother with that subpoint. Rework it or replace it, or don't use subpoints, something like that. So basically, I typically have two contentions, you can have three. Each contention should independently of each other prove the resolution to be true, You may or may not have subpoints under your contention. Those subpoints must, independently of each other, prove the contention to be true. So you should be able to win a whole round on one subpoint, if you need to. And you should be able to win a whole round on any of your subpoints, or any of your contentions, if you need to. And so, each contention, or each subpoint under the contention, should follow the claim, warrant, impact structure. So, claim, inflation increases; warrant, here's a study by Georgia Tech; impact, workers can't afford basic necessities. Like, that's my claim, warrant, and impact. That is a persuasive argument to the judge. So, after you're done preparing your whole speech, you're going to want to practice it. You're going to want to practice delivering a speech. And the big things about delivery in debate is this: judges are told not to vote on delivery. They shouldn't vote for just like, you made worse arguments, but you said it better, so I vote for you. They will anyway. Especially in leagues with less experienced judging, they will do that anyway. And so, how do you deliver a speech well in the context of debate? It does not have to be memorized, but eye contact is still important. And so you can have like the arguments that you're making in front of you on a computer, and you can be reading off of them, but you still want to have moments where you look up, look at your judge, and really connect with them. Usually, that's when you're delivering your impact. So you can be like, contention 1, inflation increases, according to a study published by Scott 2014, working for Georgia Tech, quote, when you increase the minimum wage by 10%, you have a corresponding 5% increase in prices, end quote. Judge, this means that all of the prices in your stores, all of the prices that you pay for everyday goods get more expensive. That is extremely hard for workers on low incomes to afford, that kind of thing. You want to be making eye contact whenever you are like delivering a very strong point that is going to have some kind of resonance with the judge. But the biggest things about debate delivery are this. One is that you have to be clear. Don't stutter, don't mumble over your words. Obviously, if you have some kind of speech impediment, like tell your judge, hey, don't dock me for this. But if you don't have a speech impediment, anything like that, if it's not like actively ableist to mark you down for slurring or mumbling or stuttering or things like that, then do whatever you can, or just in any case, do whatever you can to try to be as clear as possible. So when you're delivering a speech in debate, everyone should be able to hear you. I don't care if they're like an old granny. If you're like on an auditorium stage and there's an old granny way over in the corner with hearing damage, she forgot her hearing aids, like she should be able to understand every single word that you're saying, both because you're loud enough and you're audible, and also because you're not mumbling, you're not stuttering. Everything that you're saying is very clear. You're clearly differentiating each word from the next, and it's like you're just easy to follow, easy to understand. That's the first big thing about debate delivery. You need to be clear. You need to be audible. And the next big thing, which is kind of not necessarily something you need to do, but just especially as you get into higher levels of debate, don't be too slow. Because if you're really, really slow, it's hard to get out enough arguments to be able to win a round in the time that you have. Remember, debate is not speech. Some leagues will try to make you think that it is, but debate at its core is different from speech. And we'll coach you, if you're at Fort Walton at least, we'll coach you in different leagues and when you need to be a little more speechy, when you need to be a little more debatey. But when you're delivering a debate speech, you should be clear, you should be audible, but you can be relatively quick. You can have kind of repetitive body language and stuff like that. Like when I'm delivering a debate speech, I kind of speak at a relatively fast pace, and I'm like using my hands like this in order to emphasize what I'm saying, but it's kind of like a constant. And like, that's fine debate delivery because I'm very clear, I'm pretty quick, I'm getting out everything I have to say, everyone can hear me. That's a-okay debate delivery. Don't worry about being too fancy. Obviously, if you can be a better speaker, like, you know, looking at your judge, using good body language, stuff like that, if you can do that without sacrificing on content, then by all means go for it. But mainly in debate, it is the content that judges are looking for. So, that's going to be how you deliver the speech. Then, so practice it, basically, for 5 minutes-ish before you get into your room. be practicing your speech, just making sure that you're in that 2-minute time window, because 2 minutes is very restrictive. After that, you're going to deliver your speech, and then you are going to be asked questions by your opponent. When you're answering those questions, try to answer them in this way. Try to be not necessarily overly wordy. Don't take up time for the sake of taking up time, but make sure that you're answering each question thoroughly. I would avoid simple yes, no's, that kind of thing. Unless, like, there are some scenarios where you would say yes or you would say no, but as a general rule, try to be relatively not long-winded, but thorough with your answers. And definitely try not to concede things and try not to fall for traps. As you get more experience, you'll start to see traps before they actually hit you. But basically, if your opponent asks you a question, try to stick very closely with what you've said and what you believe. If your opponent asks you something weird, just say, I don't see how that's relevant, something like that. If your opponent asks you something pointed, like if they want a point of clarification, just clarify. Tell them what you mean. If they're asking you something that you see as like, I think this is a trap, try to throw them off a little bit. Like, maybe they expect you to say yes, but maybe you actually say no, and you kind of explain why you're saying no, that kind of thing. I remember I was once asked, is death bad? And I was like, well, it depends on the situation. And that completely threw them for a loop. And don't be like obtuse. Don't be like, would it be bad if every single person in the world died of a nuclear bomb explosion? And you're like, actually, I think it would be a really good thing if everyone in the world died, because then the animal kingdom would be able to thrive. Like, don't be obtuse. Don't say things that are absurd, especially in leagues with less experience judging. But do try to stick closely with what your advocacy is. Try not to stray away from it, and try not to concede things. If your opponent says, like, tries to lead you down this path of logic and then say, so doesn't that mean your second contention doesn't hold weight? Never say yes to that question. If your opponent basically asks you, doesn't that get rid of your argument? Say no every time, every single time, no matter what. Even if you have no justification, just say no. Like, you've heard that advice about drugs so many times. Just say no. So, after you're done answering questions, then it will be your opponent's turn to speak, assuming you were on the ask. If you were on the neg, then your opponent spoke first and you asked first. So just reverse the order of this part. But your opponent is now speaking. When your opponent is speaking, you need to be writing down what they are saying. And when I say need, I don't mean I suggest you write down what they're saying. I mean you need to write down what they're saying. But your opponent is going to say a lot in 2 minutes. They're going to be speaking relatively quick. You're not going to be able to write down every single word. Write down the taglines, basically fill in, like, contention 1, right? C1. If it's about the economy, write C1 hyphen econ. And then, like, maybe subpoint A is inflation, put A colon INF period. C dash INF up arrow, right? Like, whatever shorthand works for you, do it, but make sure you're writing in shorthand. Make sure that you're shortening whatever your opponent is saying so that you can get down every single thing that they're saying. Because if you forget to write something down, you're not going to be able to actually respond to it, and that's going to be very bad for you. If there's something you didn't catch that they said, feel free to ask clarifying questions in cross-examination, but if you can write it down, do so. Like, try to get to a point where you're not having to ask those kinds of questions anymore because you're writing down everything that your opponent is actually saying. So, after you're done writing everything down, that's called flowing, by the way. Just the process of writing down what your opponent has to say in a debate round is called flowing. So after you're done writing down everything that they're saying, they're done with their speech, that's when it's your turn to ask questions. Your goal in cross-examination is the exact opposite of what your goal was when you're answering questions. You want your opponent to concede things, you want them to go down like paths of logic from which they can't escape, that kind of thing. You don't want them to just be comfortable. You want them to kind of have to be on terms that they're not entirely comfortable being on. What do I mean? When you're asking a question, try to get at some kind of underlying assumption behind their position and question that assumption. That's kind of a nebulous thing that I just said. Let me try to break that down. Let's say that your opponent made the argument that it is just, that it is good for justice. It creates a more just society for people to earn a living wage. And you have evidence that you read in your case, in your constructive speech, that increasing the living wage causes people to lose their jobs. A very good question to ask in that case is like, is it just for people to lose their jobs? That is a great question. Great, great question. Why? Think about the kind of situation it puts your opponent in. Let's say they say yes. Let's say they say, yes, it is just for people to lose their jobs. Well, then the judge is going to be thinking, like, what is this guy talking about? Like, obviously it's not just for people to lose their jobs. That's just patently false. But let's say your opponent says no, it's not just for people to lose their jobs. What does that mean you can do? That means you can get up in your rebuttal speech and you can say, Judge, my opponent conceded that it is unjust for people to lose their jobs. They told you that the reason why they win is because they create a more just society, but as I've proven to you, they are causing people to lose their jobs, which they conceded makes society unjust, therefore you vote for me. Boom. You can win on that. You can straight up win the round on that argument. And so when I say question an assumption, or when I say cause them to concede, or cause them to fall down a trap or a path of logic that they don't want to go down, that's the kind of thing that I mean. And that's going to be basically your goal in cross-examination. Every person's cross is going to look different. We're going to coach you, if you're at Fort Walton at least, we're going to coach you on how to ask good cross-examination questions. Feel free to talk to me about that and that kind of thing. So, sorry, no water. Anyway, so after cross-examination is done, what you're then going to move to is rebuttal. You're going to have 1 minute to prepare your rebuttal, but the thing about rebuttal is that you're going to want to obviously respond to your opponent's arguments and say why they're wrong. But there's a few different ways to do that, and some are more powerful than others. So let's go back to our example about how increasing the minimum wage to a living wage creates a more just society. Let's say that I'm on the negative and I want to respond to that argument. There are two different ways for me to do that. One is to say no it doesn't. That I don't know, I have a different definition of justice to you that means that people earning a living wage actually doesn't result in a more just society, or my opponent did not give us very good reasons to actually believe that increasing the living wage does lead to a more just society. I would say that the distribution of wages doesn't have anything to do with justice. We have no reason to believe that it does, blah, blah, blah. That's an argument that you can make. Perfectly good argument. There's nothing wrong with that argument. But that argument is what we call defensive. What I mean by that is that it provides the judge a reason to not vote for your opponent, right? So your opponent said, vote for me, I create a more just society. You come in and say, no you don't. The judge then no longer has a reason to go out and vote for your opponent because they're not creating a more just society. So that is defensive. It prevents your opponent from winning. It defends you against your opponent winning the round. The other way to respond to it is the way that I just gave the example of, is to say that, well, actually, when people lose their jobs, that makes society less just, and so therefore, the affirmative is actually creating injustice in society. They are not creating justice. That argument is also very good, but it's even more strategic. It's better because it creates what's called offense, where let's say your judge buys the argument that the affirmative does not create justice. That still doesn't mean you vote negative. It just means that the affirmative doesn't create justice. You still haven't given the judge an actual reason to vote for you with that argument. But let's say they buy the argument that the affirmative actively creates injustice. If your judge believes that, then they're going to vote for the negative, right? You created an active reason why you should vote for the negative, and not just a reason why you should not vote for the affirmative. And so that's the basic difference between offense and defense. Offensive arguments win rounds. Defensive arguments prevent your opponent from winning a round on a specific point. And so all of your constructive arguments, your cases, are all pieces of offense that you're introducing into the round, which you will then try to carry into the final speech. And so, okay, let's talk a little bit about rebuttal strategy in the face of this. You have two different goals in rebuttal. The first is that you want to respond to your opponent's arguments. When you're responding to your opponent's arguments, you want to do so largely in an offensive way. So if you can find an offensive argument that responds to your opponent, then go for it, because then that provides the judge an active reason to vote for you. If you have no such offensive argument, you want to make sure you have at least a defensive response to everything your opponent is saying. Because if you don't, if your opponent says something and you just don't respond to it, the judge is then forced to assume that it is true. And it doesn't matter what it is. It could be that, like, increasing the minimum wage results in a meteor shower, and, like, God is going to send down the wrath of the heavens onto the earth and is going to cause another, like, great flood that's going to wipe out all life. Like, that's just an absurd argument. Like, it's just obviously false. But if I never respond to it, if I never say anything about that, then the judge is forced to be like, well, you know, the AF told me that we're going to have a great flood, and the neg never responded, so I guess we're going to have a great flood. I guess I have to vote on it. And so you want to make sure you have something that responds to each argument. Even if it's just like, this doesn't matter, here's why. We'll get to that when we get to our closing speeches or our crystallization speeches. But even if it's just that, you still want to have something in response to each argument. And that's going to be what you do on your opponent's arguments. On your arguments, you're going to want to do something that's called extending. And so, basically, when I'm giving my constructive speech, when I am introducing new arguments into the round, I am basically, imagine I have a flow sheet in front of me, like I have a piece of paper where I've written down all the arguments. I want to get all of the arguments that I've, like, introduced in my constructive speech. I want the judge to still believe them at the end of the round. Imagine my arguments are just like a bunch of arrows on a piece of paper. I want to extend those arrows all the way to the end, and I want the judge to still continue to believe them. And so, alongside responding to your opponent's arguments, you need to extend your own arguments as well. Because if you're not, and by extend your own arguments, I mean basically move that arrow forward. Say why the argument is still true, regardless of what your opponent said. And so, it's less important to extend all of your own arguments than it is to respond to all of your opponent's arguments. Why? If you don't extend one of your arguments, assuming that your opponent didn't try to, like, respond to it in an offensive way, respond to any offensive responses to your arguments. But if your opponent just kind of defensively says, oh, living wage doesn't cause justice, you as the AF can say, like, okay, living wage doesn't cause justice, but I can still win because living wage causes, like, I don't know, poverty to go down. And I can still win on that, even if I don't win on justice. And so you don't necessarily need to extend all of your arguments. If your opponent said, living wage causes injustice, you need to respond to that, because that is a reason why your opponent wins. And if you drop, and by drop I just mean not respond to it, if you drop a reason why your opponent wins, then you just lose. You automatically lose the round on the spot, assuming your opponent extends it, which any good opponent will. So, when you're extending your own arguments, there's a few different ways to do it. There's two different ways to do it, actually. It's precisely two. One is to just say that it was dropped. Like, if you make a contention, your opponent doesn't respond to the contention, say in your speech, my opponent dropped my first contention, which told you this, here's why it matters in today's debate, and you're good. But whenever you're extending an argument, you don't just say, my opponent dropped this, extend it. You always explain, my opponent dropped this, it said this, here's why it matters. And that here's why it matters is not just the impact of the actual argument, like the impact on, oh, poverty will go down, and that's bad because people's quality of life goes down, blah, blah, blah. It's also, why does it matter in the round? Like, I have therefore proven to you that poverty goes down under the affirmative. That is a reason to vote for the affirmative because we want fewer people to live in poverty, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's what I mean by explain the impact. It's not just the impact that originally was there, it's also the impact that winning that argument has on the round. The next way to respond to arguments or to extend arguments, is to what's called frontline. And by frontlining, it's basically your opponent answered your argument, gave like 3 responses to it. Frontlining is just countering the responses. So like, on my first contention, I told you that inflation goes up. He gave you 3 responses. 1 was that he has this study, but this study is bad because it's less recent. 2 was that, economic theory, but that's incorrect because of this economist. Like, that's what I mean, basically. Frontlining is just responding to your opponent's answers to your argument. You do that, and then after you frontline, you do the same thing you did when it's dropped. You basically say, therefore, extend this contention, which matters because blah, blah, blah. And then you explain the impact of extending that contention in the round. In an extemporaneous debate speech, you have about 2 minutes. If you are the negative debater, you want 1 minute to be extending your arguments, 1 minute to be responding to the AF. If you're the affirmative and you're having to give your rebuttal speech immediately after the negative goes, the negative shouldn't have responded to anything yet, so you can spend all of your time responding to the negative. So that's rebuttals. Next, you have a minute of prep time before you get to the final speech of the round, your crystallization, or your closing speech. We call it crystallization, because you crystallize the round. You like make it solid in your judge's mind what happened. No water, sorry. Anyway, when you crystallize, what you're doing is you're not introducing new arguments. Oh, you're not introducing new arguments in rebuttal either. Like in your rebuttal speeches, you're not saying anything new. You're just responding to what your opponent said, or you're giving additional reasons to believe what you said, but you're not making completely new arguments. You can introduce new evidence, but you cannot make new arguments. In your crystallization speech, you can neither make new arguments nor introduce new evidence. You can't do either. But basically, your goal in crystallization is not to make new arguments, not even to make new responses to old arguments. It is to say, after everything we've heard, why do I win? And so, in your constructive speeches, you're going to hear a bunch of arguments on both sides. In your rebuttal speeches, both sides are going to be arguing with each other about who has better evidence, and why is my author more convincing, and why does this argument, still stand despite my opponent's responses, blah, blah, blah. In your constructive speech, you're going to basically break down for your judge, okay, you've heard a lot in the last 4 speeches of this round. Here's what mattered, right? It mattered that my opponent dropped my first contention, because that proves to you that poverty will go down, which is a voter issue. That is the key to constructives are voter issues. And voter issues are basically you telling your judge, hey, vote on this. This is a reason why you vote for me in today's debate. The way I like to think about crystallization speeches is that they are constructive speeches on the resolution resolved, I won the debate. And your evidence is just going to be the stuff that was already said in the round. And so your voter issues could be like, the affirmative reduces poverty. My opponent dropped my first contention, which told you blah, blah, blah. That results in a decrease in poverty. That decrease in poverty matters for low-wage workers. It matters for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. It makes society more just. That is a major impact in today's debate. It was extended all the way from my constructive. It still is in the round right now. It is a major voting issue for the affirmative, right? That's going to be basically the core of what you're doing in a constructive speech. But you also need to consider that your opponent is kind of doing similar things. Your opponent also says that this argument matters, this argument matters, this argument matters. And so how can I, as a judge, understand if my opponent, if the affirmative says that poverty is a voting issue, and the negative says that inflation is a voting issue, which way do I vote, right? Answer that question for your judge. And the way you answer that question is by doing something called weighing. And this is when defensive rebuttals start to become a little useful. Because weighing basically says, okay, even if the other side proves that this is true, here's why it doesn't matter, or here's why it matters less than this. So weighing could be like, weigh poverty over inflation, because inflation is an economic concept about the general rise in prices. It harms the middle class and wealthy more than the poor. That's not true, but let's just say it is for the sake of argument. but poverty is something that very specifically harms the least advantaged members of society. It is an extremely important social goal that we reduce poverty. Therefore, poverty is more important than inflation. Weigh arguments about poverty more than arguments about inflation. That answers the question that I have as a judge, which is like, which way do I vote if one side tells me this is a voting issue, one side tells me this is a voting issue? The way you as a debater resolve that is you tell the judge what is most important. And so it can come in the form of like, poverty is more important than inflation. It can come as like a direct comparison between two things. It can come as a, do not weigh this. So it can come as a general, here's why inflation is not important. Like, you know, that's where defensive responses come in, where you could say that like, you know, they tell you that inflation happens, but I gave you this study which tells you that the amount of inflation is actually very small. That's called mitigatory defense. It's defensive arguments that mitigate the impact of the argument that the other side made, and that allows you to weigh, where you basically say, oh, don't weigh inflation. I gave you this piece of evidence that tells you that the actual amount of inflation is going to be very small, therefore don't evaluate it as an impact. It's barely going to do anything. It's going to be insignificant. That is a way of weighing that just tells you don't value this thing. Another way of doing it, as I said, you can compare two things directly. Another way of doing it is to say that one thing is very, very important and you weigh it above anything else. So I can say like, weigh poverty above anything else. You know, the government has an active goal to reduce poverty in this country. Poverty causes major negative effects to health and education and society. It is a, you know, cause of like tens of thousands of premature deaths. Poverty is the most important impact in the round. Weigh arguments about poverty before anything else. As a judge, if you say that, then I'll be like, okay, well the AF proved that poverty goes down, the neg proved that inflation goes down and unemployment goes up and blah, 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 but the AF told me that poverty was the most important. The negative didn't give me any reason to believe why it wasn't. And so I vote AF. Right? That's why you would be weighing. And so, that's how you crystallize. That should be all for our Extemporaneous Debate Masterclass. I know this was kind of long, and I appreciate everyone who's still here for bearing with me. My voice is completely shot, but if you have any questions, ask me in the comments. Ask me in the comments, and I'll make sure to answer them. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you had a great time, and that this helped in your debate journey.